I think paths forward could change the world. I see problems. I often think of paths forward as the key solution that would make things better. I have two recent examples, but first, what is paths forward? It is some of my ideas about error correction mechanisms. Specifically, they're about fixing known errors. So, we make a lot of errors, and many of them no one knows the solution to, or even no one knows there's a problem there. And fixing those requires creativity, it requires new discoveries, and that can take an indefinite amount of time. However, there are other errors where someone already knows the answer, and they're willing to share the answer, but you don't know it yet. And that is an avoidable error in a way that the other errors are not avoidable. If we would just listen to everyone with good ideas, we could find out about these known errors and fix them right away, since the issue is already known and understood. So paths forward asks questions like, if this other guy is right and I'm wrong, by what mechanism or path or set of steps can he tell me and my error actually gets corrected? Another way to view it is it's about having open, ongoing discussion where you accept criticism from the general public. I have a bunch of writing explaining more details, so let's talk about two examples of problems I ran into where I thought paths forward would help. First one, I've been reading some nutrition and health books, and like food and diet. And it's hard to fact check everything. It's hard to sort out which things are right. And if this issue had paths forward, it would be a lot easier. But no one on either side really debates, takes responsibility for explaining things, addresses the issues. They all write like an incomplete book that doesn't really engage with the other side's arguments and talk past each other, and it's hard to sort things out. Whereas if people had paths forward, you could go to some of the leaders of different viewpoints and ask them some questions, and this would make them engage with the other side, because you take the anti-gluten arguments and you ask them to some of the pro-gluten people, and vice versa, until one side runs out of arguments and you get more of a clear conclusion, or at least a good sense of where the debate is at, what arguments are refuted and what arguments are open, unrefuted, seem important. So another example, I was reading The Art of Problem Solving by Russell Ackoff, and he was talking about circular organizations. So there's this problem in companies where there's a way that they're worse than democracies. In a democracy, the lawmakers have authority over you, the public, the citizens. However, they're responsible to you. In a way, you're their boss. You can fire them and vote in someone else. So there's a bit of checks and balances. They don't just have unlimited authority to do whatever they want to you, because you can replace them if you don't like what they're doing. However, in companies, in general, the workers have no authority over CEOs. They have no input or influence or whatever over the CEO. They, in fact, are responsible to the CEO or to their boss. The boss tells them what to do, and then they have to report to their boss. So politicians report to the voters, not vice versa. The voters don't have to say what they've been doing lately and explain themselves. It's the politicians who have to explain themselves to voters. But in a company, it's the workers who have to explain themselves to their boss, who has authority over them. So the boss doesn't have to explain himself to the worker and has authority over that worker. So the power all goes in one direction instead of being mixed and going in both directions. So this is the problem with companies that democracy has an advantage over. Democracy is not perfect, but at least has some good mechanism here, and a lot of companies just don't have anything at all to try to address this. So Ackoff talks about an idea of a circular organization, where you make the authority go in a circle, so the people at the bottom have some authority over the top, and that way everyone has someone with some authority over them. Or not authority, but being reported to, being able to have some influence. So the workers at the bottom don't give the CEO orders, but they would have some influence to affect his policies, and he would have to report to them, answer to them, address their questions. And they would have some little bit of power over him, some limited things they could do. And so he proposed, so CEOs, there's a board of directors for companies, and he proposed basically having something kind of like a board of directors at every level above every manager. And then for the CEO's board of directors, like his personal one, you put representatives of labor on it. So that makes the organization circular because the people at the bottom have a role for dealing with the people at the top. Being on the board is different than being someone's boss, but it gives you something. Anyways, my thought about that was it's okay, but it's still about allocating authority better. So it's a bit of a who should rule problem, to put it in Popperian terms. And so I thought a better approach would be paths forward. A company could have paths forward, and then it doesn't matter that much who has authority over who, because everything can get settled with rational debate. Paths forward, in a way, makes authority not matter by giving authority to reason and truth-seeking processes, so that the best arguments will decide the outcome, rather than it being a matter of who has the authority to make their decision. You actually debate it, and the winner of the debate makes the decision. Authority would still matter in some ways, but you could reduce it a lot if you had paths forward. That way, whenever one of the subordinates has a good idea, his idea can get implemented. So it didn't matter that he was a subordinate. His idea got implemented anyways. So you can solve a lot more of the problem, I think, with paths forward than with Akoff's circular organization. And by the way, Akoff's organization asks managers to spend 25% of their time in the board meetings. That's his estimate of how long it would take. So that's a big cost. It's not just like a wasted cost though. Like, you talk about actual company issues and get things done during the meetings. So maybe it's okay, but there's a potential problem there. And paths forward in organizations, potentially everyone could do it, but there are also smaller steps you could take. Like, only the managers do it, or only upper management does it, or only the CEO does it. And that you could get most of the benefit. If it's only the CEO, you could probably get 80% of the benefit. Why? Because everyone else is like underneath the CEO. So if you have a problem with your boss and he doesn't do paths forward, you can go to the CEO and go to paths forward about your idea. There's something higher up in the power hierarchy that does have paths forward. So you can do a lot that way. You could also just have one additional person. You don't want the CEO to be busy all day doing paths forward. He has to do the company leadership stuff too. So you could have co-CEOs, or you could add a new position for the paths forward guy, who would have authority similar to a CEO. He'd have to be up at the top, but then his job could be to do paths forward for everyone. That would be a potential way to change a company by hiring one new person that could potentially make a really large improvement. So people's main objection to paths forward is time use. And I think that's fairly obvious bad faith, because I've already written a lot of solutions to how to do PF fast enough, how to do it in a small enough amount of time. And the people who say it would take too long never engage with those solutions. They just act like I had no solutions and I hadn't even thought of the problem. So yes, time use is an obvious potential problem that needs to be addressed in some way, which is why I came up with half a dozen answers to it. And they have not pointed out why those answers won't work or tried those answers. So it seems like they just want an easy excuse to rationalize not doing paths forward. And I think that's sad. If you're going to be biased and you're a good or rational person, you should be biased in favor of paths forward. You should be extra charitable to it because you want it to work. You really, really want rationality to be able to be done fast enough, and you have no good alternatives. So you'd be like bending over backwards to make paths forward methods actually work because you really, really want the outcome of having more rational discussions and more error correction. But these other people, they're just looking for excuses not to do it. So being biased against error correction and wanting excuses to avoid it is really sad, but widespread among not just people, but specifically people with some sort of interest in rationality, like you would find out less wrong, or on some sort of rational subreddit. Like that kind of self-selected person who's extra into rationality compared to most people, I've found that type of person often just makes excuses to not really take paths forward seriously and not give it a chance. Even though they have no good alternative, there's no competitor that they like better than paths forward. Their alternative is to not have a method. So that means doing things like trusting yourself and like trying to be rational, whatever that means, but with no specific like rules, guidelines, method, steps you're going to do. Nothing in writing about what you're going to do. You just like try to have good judgment and hope you're rational, and they seem satisfied with that, and that's such a recipe for a bias. Okay, so how does paths forward address time use? One of the big ones is reusing answers. You can write down a canonical answer to something, and then if two people raise the same issue, you reuse your answer. And if people raise different issues, that's actually good. You want to address all the different issues, all the different criticisms that people think of. You don't want to just leave a criticism unaddressed, so it's never been addressed by anyone ever. That would be bad. Another answer is having proxies or helpers who can answer stuff for you. That is most available if you have a lot of money, if you're very popular. But if you don't have much money and you're not popular, then you're probably not going to get a lot of inquiries, a lot of critics trying to talk to you. So as the number of people who want to talk to you scales up, your ability to get helpers should also scale up somewhat proportionally. So I think that's a reasonable solution. Another one, this is probably the single most important thing, is addressing patterns of error or categories of error instead of doing errors one by one. So if people make new things by making slight changes to old things, then addressing them all would take way too long. And reusing an answer you can't reuse an answer if you answer one really specific thing and then they slightly change it, because now your old answer doesn't apply. So in order for answer reuse to actually be effective, you have to address categories of issues, types of issues, patterns. And this is what people commonly do. For example, we have the ad hominem fallacy, it's sometimes called, which is the error of insulting someone instead of making arguments. And so instead of addressing every single insult as an individual case with a new answer, we talk about the whole category of insulting someone rather than making an argument. And you can write a generic explanation of what is an insult and what is an argument and how do you tell the difference. And how do you know when someone's doing ad hominems and why is that bad and so on. And you could explain all that and you could write it down one time. And then you could reuse that every time someone does an insult. And if they come up with a new insult, you can still reuse your answer. Another thing you can do for pass forward is gate access to protect your time, so you don't actually answer everyone. But you have to do this in a way where if someone has a good point, there is something they could do to get your attention. So most current access gating is based on either social status, bias, or a proxy for social status. Like it's indirectly based on social status. And so pass forward says do not gate on those things. You should not limit access to yourself based on social status or bias in any way. Those are bad ways to filter people out. And whatever gates you come up with, you should write them down. So you should have clear written rules and then hold yourself accountable to them. You need to have transparency. That way people can know in advance, like, what do they have to do to get your attention and get their issue addressed. And if they do get your attention, like, what will you do? Like, I have a debate policy, so you know, if you get my attention, you get a debate, here are the rules for the debate. So then I will follow those rules. Whereas, if you just know, like, if I do the following things, then I will get to say my idea to the person, but they might just, like, ignore me or say it's dumb, and then I don't get to respond. If it's like that, you realize you might not get anywhere. So there need to be a bunch of rules about what happens once you share the idea, so it doesn't get incorrectly dismissed. Anyways, if you write down a bunch of policies for this stuff, and then you have transparency whenever people make requests, the way you deal with it is publicly visible, then you can build up a track record of actually following your policies, and people can see when you don't follow the policies, so if you have a reputation, then they can trust you're not going to want to destroy your reputation, so you'll have to follow your policies. An example of gating that would be rational is you would say, okay, if you want to have a pass forward and tell me your criticism, you have to give me $20. Now, anyone can give you $20, and if it's important, they're probably going to be willing to give you $20. There are downsides here. It could be harder for some people to tell you some criticism. However, it is a solvable problem where people could come up with the $20. It might be like nearly unsolvable for a child whose parents don't want to help. They might have to like wait until they're old enough to get a job. But if they actually have a good idea, they could probably just make a GoFundMe for $20. I mean, maybe they can't, they don't have a bank account. But maybe they could just like ask the internet for help and get someone else to send you $20 on their behalf. If they have a good idea and they like share it on Reddit and other people notice and say, hey, that's a good idea, and they say, but I'm a child and I can't possibly get $20 for like 5 years, then someone will probably just send the $20 so they can get their pass forward. So anyways, the point is, if you put a $20 paywall in front of each pass forward request, each criticism people want to share with you, it does not fully block off you being corrected. It adds friction to the process, but it doesn't mean that some corrections are just never going to be able to reach you. If the person cares to tell you the idea enough, they can pay $20. And there are other things you can do. You can say, hey, you have to read a book, and then I will listen to one criticism. Like, if you have not read my book, I won't listen to your criticism. And if someone has an important thing to say to you, then they can read the book, and then they can get their discussion. They're not... important things to say are not being blocked off. Like, if the barrier to entry is reading one book, a lot of people are not going to bother with that. And the friction does have downsides. But, like, if I saw someone making a mistake and I wanted to correct them and I thought it was important and I cared, right now, often I have, like, no options. And in this better world, if I could just read their book and then tell them, that actually sounds reasonable. I don't mind reading a book if I get to correct someone who has some sort of importance in the world on something. So those are some examples of gating that is not based on social status or bias. If you ask someone to pay $20 or to read your book first, they can just do that regardless of their social status and regardless of your biases. Something that is a proxy for social status is, if you want my attention, you have to basically social network your way into my circle. Like, you make friends with someone who makes friends with someone who I know, like, having some sort of personal contact. Anyway, people might not see that as being like, what is your social status? Because you might have high social status in a different group or something. But, it is very related to social status and social hierarchy. That's the kind of thing you want to avoid. Another example is, I think, basically academic journal publishing is primarily gated by social status, not quality. And obviously they're not going to directly admit that and base it directly, openly on social status, but I think they use a bunch of things that are proxies for status. Okay, anyways, how else does PathForward address time use? We talked about reusing answers, criticizing patterns and categories instead of individual things, having proxies or helpers, and gaining access in rational ways. Another way is by making conversations shorter by using decisive arguments. If you have a lot of debate skill, then that can reduce the time use needed for debate. And it's not just skill, but it's also partly attitude and methodology. If you know about my yes or no philosophy stuff, about using binary decisive arguments, then that makes debates go faster. It's better at reaching conclusions in debates. Anyway, so I thought those things are enough that people could try PathForward and see what goes wrong, or at least give criticism of those methods. But instead, people have just said it would take too long, and then not engaged with those solutions, and not tried them. So it seems like they don't want PathForward. They are biased against it. Rationality, scares them in some way. Anyway, PathForward does have some other problems, too, which I've written less about. So one I've encountered that I think is pretty important that the people objecting to PathForward never bring up. I've never heard this one brought up. But having tried PathForward a bit and getting other people to try it just a little bit, I've run into this. So the problem is that people lie. This is much less of a problem if it is a public intellectual who has a reputation. So if he lies, but he has all these written PathForward policies, and then he's just lying about them, he's going to get in trouble, he's going to lose reputation. But if someone is giving PathForward, and they do not have a reputation to protect, then they can just not follow their own policies. So this came up with someone. They put up a PathForward policy, and then I tried to use it, and then they didn't want to do what they said they would do. So then they just edited their policy and said, oh, okay, I will change the policy to match what I'm actually going to do. And if you change your policy to match your behavior, instead of changing your behavior to match the policy, you're completely defeating the purpose of it and being dishonest. And it works the other way. So the person giving the PathForward can lie and just not follow their own policies. And then also, the critics can lie. So a good example of this is if you have debate rules, you say, hey, if you want to tell me this criticism, we're going to have a debate, and here is the methods we'll follow in the debate, including, these are the following ways that the debate can end, and we will not stop unless we reach one of these particular conclusions on the list. And someone can agree to that, and then just lie and break the rules and just leave without meeting the conditions, which is a thing that happened to me. someone agreed to my debate policy, and then at the end, they just decided to not do it. Like, they wanted the conversation to end, but they didn't follow the methods of, here's how you end the conversation. You have to, like, do certain steps at the end so that the conversation doesn't just end in the middle. And they agreed to that in advance and then refused to do it. So there's a problem there, that people are just dishonest, and even if you have written policies, they can just break the rules. When they get upset or triggered or defensive or something, it motivates them to come up with excuses for not following the rules that they agreed to, even if it's all in writing and there's transparency and everything. They can just be irrational anyways. I don't think that's a deal-breaker problem. Like, it's not worse than the status quo. I think that having things like explicit policies makes that problem better, not worse, compared to the status quo. But it's an issue to be concerned with. There's room for improvement there. And so there's one more difficulty with paths forward that I want to talk about. And this one, I think, is pretty important. The short version of it is simply that people dislike rational criticism. Paths forward is about people actually receiving rational criticism, but people do not like that. And this goes both ways. The paths forward giver, obviously, is setting himself up to be exposed to a bunch of criticism. And if his critics are actually right, he might hate that. So that is a potential problem for paths forward. And then it also goes the other way. The critics themselves, how do you deal with criticism that is incorrect? You criticize it, you refute it, you have to, like, counter it in debate. So the people who try to tell you criticism will frequently be criticized themselves. Their arguments, their ideas will receive criticism. So you have someone who's probably not a public intellectual, just a member of the public, and they come try to tell you their great idea, and then you respond with criticism. And so a lot of people are going to have a bad time. They're going to hate that. And so I've thought of paths forward the most in the context of, like, a public intellectual, including a scientist, being the person doing paths forward. And that is an area where it works relatively well and makes a lot of sense. And it has less of a problem with offending people. If the public doesn't like you and you're a public intellectual and a lot of people are offended by you, it is still completely possible to have a good career, be successful. That can be okay. You don't have to be really popular to be a rational, truth-seeking intellectual type. You need your boss to not hate you, and maybe some academic journal editors or some scientific collaborators or something. But if you can actually have the majority of the public dislike you and go on with your career as normal. So offending some people by doing paths forward could be okay. But there are other contexts where offending people is a bigger problem. So one that I talked about earlier was in a company. That paths forward in a company could be helpful and solve the problem of authority better than Akoff's circular organization idea. However, in a company, who is going to be telling you criticism and trying to share ideas with you? Your employees. If you offend your employees, that is bad. That could demoralize them. Some of them could quit. You don't want to have your employees dislike you and be upset with you and all that. So that is a real problem. You want to deal with your employees in a relatively tactful way, not in a way that offends and bothers them. And also, you want them to actually give suggestions, even if they're not that good at rationality. So you would like to respond to suggestions in a friendly way so that you can get the good suggestions. Whereas with the general public, if you, like, offend and alienate a lot of people and only the more rational people want to talk to you, that's kind of okay. But if you're a decent-sized company, you probably want your less rational employees to be able to communicate and stuff and not be too scared of criticism and so on. Whereas if you're like a scientist or a public intellectual and the people in the public who are scared of criticism don't talk to you, that's kind of okay. Because if everyone talked to you, that'd be too many people anyways. But in a company, if, like, all your employees are willing to communicate when they have ideas, maybe that's okay and not too much communication. In another context, a good example where paths forward could be problematic is a politician doing paths forward with his voters. And you can see, like, huge advantages and positives there. Very similar to the company thing. If the politician, instead of just having authority and making his own decisions, would sometimes have decisions based on decisive debates, that could be a lot better. You could get better policies. Instead of him just being like, I'm going to use my judgment because I have authority, you could have some of the times the truth wins. However, if a politician is offending a bunch of his voters with harsh criticism, that is a big problem for him. He's going to get voted out of office. Politicians have to be popular, even more so than CEOs. So then what? Is the world just not ready for paths forward in some contexts? People aren't rational enough? Maybe. Hard to say. What I can say is that if you tone down your criticism, it's going to cause a lot of trouble with paths forward. Because you need to win issues, like decisively and quickly win the argument, settle the issues, reach conclusions. Otherwise, it's going to take a long time. And actually, a lot of ways people argue, they never really reach a conclusion. So a lot of your discussions could just go on indefinitely. And that if a lot of people want to talk to you and your discussions take indefinite time, you're in huge trouble. You need to, for paths forward to work, you have to be able to actually resolve issues, reach conclusions. One of the things you can do that helps is you can ask a critic, do you have a clear, decisive, debate-ending thing to say or not? And if they say not, then they don't actually have a correction for you. It doesn't really count. You could still listen to them, but you can put like a time limit on it and be like, okay, well, you can have 10 minutes to tell me your idea, and then I'll take it into consideration, but we won't debate it since you're not claiming that it actually decisively wins the debate and corrects one of my errors. And then you can only actually debate people when they claim that they have a decisive criticism, a decisive argument that should conclusively change your mind in a relatively short debate. So you can make the actual debate discussions be focused on decisive arguments, because if they don't have something decisive to say, why are they even talking to you? Like, maybe they want to like just tell you a few suggestions and you'll think about it and they just like trust your judgment or whatever, but like nothing too important is happening. Okay, so question, why is decisive criticism offensive? What offends people? People tend to hate being wrong. This is a problem both for the people giving the paths forward and the critics. And people especially hate being badly wrong. Like, if you say, oh, you have a few good points in there, I'm going to change my idea, like modify 10% of it to use a few of your points. That's a lot less offensive than if you say, hey, I have a decisive refutation of what you said, so I'm just going to fully 100% reject it and use none of it, and that'll offend people a lot more. And what people especially hate is personal criticism. And there are some reasons that personal criticism, or criticism that at least seems personal to people, can come up in rational decisive debates. Rationality relies significantly on metacriticisms that address patterns of errors, methods, missing prerequisites, things like that. And people will take a lot of that stuff personally. Is it personal criticism? I don't think it has to be. I think it can be rational criticism that isn't really about a specific person, but people take it personally anyways. A good way to look at this, a test, is could you have written the same criticism before you met the person? If so, then in some sense it's impersonal. So you can actually do that. Like, you can write an article about bias or dishonesty, and then you can meet someone years later and say, hey, you're doing some of those red flags from the article. The article explained, here's how you like spot this type of bias, and here are some solutions to it. And you wrote that years ago, and now this person comes along and they do the things that the article pointed out. They're doing the red flags. So you use the methods in the article and you spot the bias, and then you link them to the article. And they say, hey, you're calling me biased. That is personal and offensive. And you say, well, I wrote it before I even knew you. This is a pre-existing opinion I had about what bias looks like. And I think bias is a topic that should actually be talked about and addressed, not just like ignored. And I mean, I think that's a reasonable thing to say, but a lot of people are going to get offended. They don't want to be called biased. They don't like the idea that their errors are related to bias and that is the type of thing they should be looking at. They want all their errors to be like topical, like part of the object level topic, not their methodology, their lack of prerequisites, their bias, their dishonesty, all that stuff. But their errors often do come from bias, dishonesty, missing prerequisites, poor methods, etc. So if I link a person to an article about bias and say, hey, you did these 3 things in our discussion, and they fit these 3 different things in the article that explain how to spot bias, that is a little bit personal because I've connected the article to some of their discussion contributions, and people take their discussion contributions personally. Because it does reflect on them. Like, they wrote those bad biased arguments. So if you say those arguments they wrote are biased, that is very similar to calling them biased. And I think the solution to this is, in short, for people to be more rational. Like, you should be happy to find out about your biases, your dishonesty, and your methodological problems. Like, those are actually really important places to correct errors in. But people tend to be extra hostile to correcting those errors. Anyways, I think this stuff is basically not ignorable. You can't just ignore a bunch of red flags for bias and then have a rational debate where they keep making mistakes due to their bias, but you never talk about the bias and you just try to respond directly to what they're saying. That is going to be really inefficient. It's going to take a long time. To decisively settle the debate quickly, you have to respond to the actual main problem that's going on, not beat around the bush. So what's the solution? I don't know. There's the gradual approach. People could just get more rational over time. A few people could try some paths forward who are better at it or more interested in it or whatever. And then that could set a good example. People could see some rational debate sometimes. And they could see when there is an irrational reaction, a lot of times people in the audience will not sympathize with the person being irrational. Even if they would do the same thing in the same situation, they often still won't sympathize with it. They'll sympathize on the side of rationality because they want to pretend to be more rational than they are. So you can do paths forward, and if you offend some people, often the people watching will not be offended. Sometimes they will, but not always. Anyway, so it could just kind of gradually grow, and people could, they could see how people get offended and learn something from it, and maybe get if you see a bunch of examples of people getting offended in debates, and then you and you think about it over the course of several years, and then you try to debate yourself, maybe you'll do better at it because you've gotten a bit of a warning on some of the things that commonly go wrong and had time to digest it when it didn't threaten you personally. Or on the time span of generations, it's even easier for progress to happen. And also, there are a lot of things people can do for self-improvement. There's self-help type stuff and also just learning things. You can study things, learn more, and that's going to help. But I don't have just a silver bullet for you dislike rationality, you dislike criticism, here's the solution, or here's a workaround that makes that irrelevant. I don't have an easy answer for that. So I think that's the main thing that holds back paths forward in the world, is that people just aren't rational enough for a rational method. Inventing a rational method is good, but people have to have a significant amount of rationality to use it. And I do have stuff explaining how to be rational, the yes or no philosophy, how to debate rationally, all that. But it's hard to get people to engage with and learn that stuff, partly because they don't have paths forward. There's a bit of a circular problem where they're making all these errors, and then they have bad error correction mechanisms. And then if you try to talk about the error correction mechanism problem, they make a bunch of errors. So you get stuck. Anyways, if people would learn more about yes or no philosophy and decisive arguments, that would help. Because a lot of why their debates are so long and indecisive is they make these inconclusive degree arguments and they make justificationist positive arguments. And that type of argument is not suitable for actually reaching conclusions and resolving issues. And so paths forward would seem a lot more plausible and viable to people if they actually had a clue how to rationally debate to a conclusion relatively quickly. Another thing that could help is if people knew more about social status stuff. So a lot of their dislike of criticism is related to status. And if they consciously saw what social status games people are playing, and all the social status stuff that was going on was transparent to them, or even if it's just partially transparent to them, if they saw in real time or even just reflecting on it within a few days, what social status behavior people were doing and what was wrong with it, its flaws, then they would do less of it. And it would be easier also to criticize social status climbing behaviors in debates, to point it out to people who know something about it, instead of people where they'd basically have to learn the topic from the ground up. That's a good example of the type of metacriticism that people often don't like, but which can settle debates a lot faster. You can say, hey, I think you're wrong because of these various you're doing social status climbing, not rationality. I think that's the problem here. However, explaining that to you would be really hard because you're missing all the prerequisites of understanding what social status climbing is and so on. And so you should go read a few books and learn about it and then come back and then we can continue the conversation at that point. And if you say that kind of thing to people, they get really upset and they want to be able to have the conversation right now without going and developing any skills. And I think that is an unreasonable thing to ask for. If you say, hey, you can go learn more about this topic and then come back and we continue, that is a path forward. It is a way that they could continue. It has some friction, but it is not a hard blocker. It's not a barrier with no way to get the error fixed. And it is not a blocker based on bias or social status. There could be a bit of bias or social status involved, because you could be more likely to put that kind of barrier in front of low status people or people that you're biased against. But at least it's not a hard barrier of that type. And if you are doing it in a biased way, maybe, hopefully, someone will notice that and criticize it. Ask for a path forward to point out your bias in how you implement your paths forward. Anyway, I think paths forward can be seen in an inspiring way if you look at it, and how it can reduce the impact of authority on people's lives and make truth matter more, and how it could get so many errors corrected in the world, and we could have a more rational world where everyone with a good idea can share their good idea with relevant people. That is such a nice vision of the world, and it could solve a lot of specific problems, like people in companies who are like, here's this problem I see, and I don't like putting up with it, and my only real option is to quit and go get a different job at a company that's going to make its own errors, so there's no real solution. Or like start your own business, but that's hard. And not everyone can do it, or they would have no employees. And so it would be really nice for labor if the suggestion box at companies was not just a black hole, and their good ideas could actually get listened to, implemented, debated to a conclusion, where either something wrong with it is explained, or it's used. And there are a lot of different concrete things where you can look at how paths forward would make this better. It would be nice if I was trying to research health and diet and food and so on, and there are actually people in the field who had paths forward who I could talk to and get some answers to questions, and if I could take criticisms from each side of the debate and bounce them off each other. Although, if people had paths forward, that probably would have already been done. Someone who is on one side of the debate, if the other side had paths forward, would probably go and tell them some criticism. And then I'd be able to see the results of that. And so a lot more issues would be resolved instead of just the debate about nutrition and so on, like gluten or vegetable oil, is just inconclusive. And it's hard to sort out. Fact-checking is another good example that applies to a lot of things. You read a book and you wonder, are these facts true? And there are just tons and tons of books where the authors do not have paths forward. So even if a bunch of readers noticed factual errors, there's no forum where you could go and check and see what criticisms of the book have been written and what the results of those debates were. Whereas if all the authors had paths forward and the debates they had were available on the internet, then whenever you read a book, you could go then look up the author's paths forward discussions and see if they got a bunch of facts corrected and criticized and refuted from their book or not, instead of having to just fact check yourself because you can't see what errors other people already noticed. And for a lot of books, it's not your field, so it's hard to fact check. There are a lot of people in a better position to fact check most topics than I am. They can just read the book and offhand notice some factual errors because they're familiar with it. So it's a really good thing if fact-checking is kind of crowdsourced, so everyone who notices errors about whatever they know about, it can all get put together into an overall fact-check instead of one person doing everything. So paths forward would enable that. But the current situation is basically no one wants to debate me and actually use my paths forward policy, so that's sad. I don't have the social status, the fame, the reputation to get a bunch of people from just the general public to take an interest in me. And my own fans all basically just think I'm so much better than them, and they will lose the debate really badly and are kind of scared off by that and don't think that they have any important correction for me. They're just like, oh, Elliot is so rational and knows so much stuff, and they struggle to think of anything I'm wrong about, I think. And then the other option is to go to other people's forums instead of my own. Except that there are literally no good rational forums on the internet that are suitable that I can find. And I have, for over a decade, I've been asking if anyone else knows of a good forum I should try. And I haven't really gotten any answers to that ever. So, yeah, none of the people who talk about at my forum, who come and try my forum, ever know of some other one that they think might be better or worthwhile or anything. Because, yeah, the obvious thing to do when you're not really popular, you don't have a large following, is to go to some other forum that is more popular instead of just relying on your own tiny forum that you don't have the reputation to attract a lot of people to. But, yeah, I just don't know any like that. So if you think you do, please tell me. That is a thing that I'd be particularly interested in Paths Forward about. I'd be particularly happy to debate. If you bring up a forum, I can say why I think it's not rational, or I can try it, or whatever. Because I would like a forum where I could get more criticism for my philosophy ideas. If there's anything wrong with yes or no philosophy, or Paths Forward, or my other ideas, I would like to find out about that. If anyone knows of errors in them, if there's some problem that other people already know about and understand, I'd like to find out. That's all. Okay, the end.